G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we're talking about some of my top tips for the F1 Fantasy game, how you can be a better F1 Fantasy strategist, and how to score the most points and build the best team every single race week. So if you're new around here, you enjoy this kind of content and you want to see more of it, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. So the first tip I'm going to impart onto you guys watching this, and these are in no particular order, is how to build a balanced lineup. The first race week of the season is always going to be the hardest one for constructing a team, partly due to the fact that we have very little information available to us other than what we see in preseason testing, and our team values are starting at 100 million, which obviously restricts the number of premium assets we want to get into our team. Paying close attention to how those budget enablers or value for money assets are performing in preseason is essential to affording those explosive, harder to get premium assets like Max Verstappen, like Red Bull constructor, like Charles Leclerc. So looking at those assets, those drivers, particularly in preseason, in those midfield teams, Visa Cash App Racing Bulls comes to mind for me. Williams comes to mind for me. Even maybe Lance Stroll at Aston Martin or the Alpines. All teams, all drivers that are typically quite reliable. You know what to expect from them, and realistically, even though we may not know what their teams are, what their cars are going to perform like throughout the course of the season, a lot of these teams have drivers we know can get the job done fantasy-wise most race weeks. So keep an eye on those guys in the preseason testing and see how they're shaping up and how they'll fill into your team once prices go live, which I expect will be after preseason testing. Another thing to think about is avoiding loading up on premium assets or a top heavy team. What I mean by that is it's very easy to get carried away with Max Verstappen and Red Bull constructor as two of the highest scoring assets in the game in 2023, but then also going for someone like a Lewis Hamilton and a Charles Leclerc, which may look good on paper, but then you're left with three driver slots and a constructor slot, which you have to fill out with budget assets. And starting the season, even though you might have Red Bull, Max and Leclerc in your team, then having to fill your team out with a Haas constructor, Kevin Magnussen, Logan Sargent, Valtteri Bottas, Nico Hülkenberg just doesn't really sound like a team that's going to go far or do well on a regular basis. So I get that Max and those premium assets are attractive, but having a balanced squad is going to help you over the course of the first few races of the season. And I appreciate that, it's going to also be hard to decide on the explosive assets, but I would argue deciding on those budget enablers is even more difficult and even more important, because it means if you're able to pick the right ones from the outset that do well, you're a step ahead of the competition. You've got those price rises in your pocket already, and it means you're not having to react to make those budget transfers further down the line, or even use a wild card if you're really not happy with your team in the first couple race weeks. The other thing I would suggest is limit the number of true punts. Now, I will say it's fine to have a differential in your team every week or so, or however often you feel is necessary, but going for three or four very low owned assets just because you think that Pierre Gasly might win the race this weekend is really not going to put you in the box seat to score the most points. It is very speculative, and I get that there's going to be the odd race here or there that you get a midfield team on the podium, but the frequency and the likelihood of that happening is very, very low. So limit the number of true punts. It's fine to go for one differential from the outset, but having two or three more, which could ultimately backfire, will put you on the back foot early on, and having to burn chips to catch up in the first couple races of the season is not exactly how I would suspect tackling the start of the fantasy season would want to go for me, or for anyone else for that matter. The next thing to think about is planning your strategy. And I'm not suggesting we have to have a 50-point plan as to how we tackle every race week with our transfers and our chip strategy. But I think a big thing about the game we saw last season that changed from 2022 was that we didn't need to make intra-week transfers to catch price rises or react to driver performance. Now, it's all well and good to have certain drivers in mind that you want to get into your team for the upcoming race week, but there's no need to make those transfers middle of the week. Wait until practice. Practice session is the most valuable tool just about to us fantasy strategists, and waiting until you've seen how the drivers and constructors perform that Friday, for instance, is going to really help guide your decision making coming into the deadline on the Saturday, which If you don't already know, I do a deadline stream with F1 Fantasy HQ, my friend Adam, over on FanAmp's YouTube channel. So check us out in the lead up to qualifying if you want your burning questions answered. But getting back to that, there's no real need to knee-jerk transfers early on in the week. Wait until the deadline or close to the deadline once you've got more information available, and then make the transfers if you still feel obligated to get in those same drivers. But more information is key, and there's no need to wait. There's no need to burn transfers early on in the week just because you feel like it. Another thing to think about is have a general idea of when you want to deploy your chips. I'm not suggesting that you have to have every single week mapped out when you want to use a chip, but I will come back with a strategy guide later in the season. There's no real need, I think, to do it now just because A, we don't know which drivers and constructors are going to look good out of the gates, and B, certain chips I suspect may not be in the game this season. We had 6 chips, an increase from 2 or 3 from 2022 last season. There's a couple that I'm a big fan of and a couple that I'm not. And if F1 are serious about this game, they're going to take out the ones that really are not value add at all to our teams. Wildcard, super valuable. Make your trades or activate the wildcard when you need to make multiple trades, or you're going to take a pretty hefty points penalty to get in new drivers into your team. Extra DRS and Limitless. I'll still stress that these 2 chips are typically best used on sprint race weekends. There are exceptions to the rule like we saw in Monza last year, but realistically these chips are going to do best on weekends where the most points are on offer, and sprint race weekends are those weekends. The other 3 chips, which I haven't listed out and are the ones I alluded to that are not really value add quite as much, there's a very low point ceiling more often than not, are Autopilot, Final Fix and No Negative. I've covered all of those in previous videos, but realistically, they don't add a lot of value to our teams. They're very speculative. You cannot really plan for them. And if you do plan for them, more often than not, from my experience last season, they didn't pay off. So I just don't know if there's a place for them in the game. There may be 1 or 2 retained, but I'm just not sure. A couple of those chips, Final Fix for me, even No Negative, I just don't know if they're chips that are that effective, to be honest. So have a general idea when you want to use these chips. And as I said, I'll put a strategy guide out for chip usage probably after the first month or so of the season, but I just don't see there being much of a point now if we're not sure what chips are in the game at this point in time. The other thing, as I said earlier, be flexible with when you want to use your chips and when you want to make your transfers. You could have certain drivers booked in to do well at certain races. The Williams at Monza, given it's a straight line circuit last year, looked really good. Getting in on Alex Albon then paid off quite well, as did Ferrari. Look at those those higher speed corners in Qatar last year where McLaren did really well. Just think about races or circuits that you think certain teams are going to perform well at. Don't necessarily plan to get them in, but have an idea in the back of your mind as when you think certain drivers and constructors are going to do well at certain race weeks. Evaluate each asset on its own. Now, I will say there are certain drivers and constructors which are very appealing based on their value and others which are based on their explosiveness. The value very much boils down to those mid-priced assets that are going to outperform their price more often than not. The explosiveness, however, is reserved for those premium assets, the Verstappens, the Leclercs, the Hamiltons, the Norrises that are going to hit pretty much the point ceiling every single race week or get close to it, assuming they're on their day. Now, it's all well and good to pick the premium options that are going to deliver you most of your points every single race week, but being specific and having a well thought out idea as to the value options is equally, if not even a little bit more important, because the value options, those enablers that you choose, are going to be the ones that allow you to afford those premium assets. And if you're able to pick, as I said before, early on, the budget enablers that are going to be reliable and just score you a consistent amount of points, we're not expecting someone like Pierre Gasly or Alex Albon or Daniel Ricciardo to score you 40 points a race week. But if they can get you 10 to 15 points a week, but it's at a very affordable price point, that's going to enable you to get to those more expensive assets. So think about the reliability, the consistency you want from those budget enablers, and that as a result will enable you to get to those premium assets that are going to score, as I said, the bulk of your points every single race week. The other thing to think about is monitor those teams in preseason in the lead up to Bahrain that might be underpriced as a result of their underperformance last season. To me, Esteban Ocon is one such driver that springs to mind purely because of the fact that he had a championship leading 7 DNFs across sprints and Grand Prix last season. So I suspect he may come in under his starting price of last season of 9.4. I don't know what to expect from the Alpine, but he is an experienced driver, and if he comes in around that $7-8 million mark, he could be a real steal. So just have an eye out for those drivers that you think could be underpriced based on A, what their teammate could be priced at, and B, what you think they're truly capable of, regardless of what their performance was like in 2023. Another thing to think about, just forget who you support in F1 Fantasy. I know it's very easy to get carried away and pick drivers that you really love. Ricciardo and Tsunoda, such a great combination. Are they going to be great fantasy assets? I'm quite optimistic, but that shouldn't mean you immediately jump in on them. It's a fantasy game. Pick the drivers and constructors that are going to score you the most points every single race week. Verstappen, Red Bull, they're popular for a reason. Lando Norris, a great second half of the season last season. Fernando Alonso, I don't know what Aston Martin are looking like, but he's experienced. He can get you fantasy points on his day. So just think about those drivers and constructors that are reliable, that are going to get you points, and simply ones that you know you're going to hold for multiple race weeks that you don't think, if something bad happened, you'd immediately want to get them out of your team. Again, going back to drivers you like and dislike, I get it. If you like Ferrari and you want triple Ferrari in your team, go for it. Play your own game. I'm not going to tell you otherwise, but it still comes down to the fact that if Ferrari are not value for money, if they're overpriced and they're not scoring your points, I don't think they're the best driver or constructors to have in your team if they're not delivering. The other thing I would say is also ignore the bandwagons. I know that maybe comes back a little bit to the differential or the risky picks, for instance, but let's say Lewis Hamilton gets his first win in 2 seasons in the first race of the season. Just because he scores 30 or 40 points in Bahrain doesn't necessarily mean at his price he could be overpriced again. He's the best asset to own. It could be a red herring. I suppose there is something to be said early in the season for, the mentality shift towards the drivers that do well early on. And as I said, it comes back to being able to pick those drivers that you think are going to do well. But I would say just because one driver has a podium that is like Kevin Magnussen, let's say he had a podium in the first race week of the season, I think that's very much an outlier. I don't think he's going to score those. We all know he's not going to score those every single week. So just because he does well one week doesn't necessarily mean that's going to translate into subsequent weeks as well. And the last thing I would stress is have a list of key sources. Find the F1 fantasy strategists and content creators that you trust. I would highly recommend F1 Fantasy Hub. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, but there are other strategists and creators out there, heaps of data sources to rely on as well, that you can essentially just maintain in a vacuum. You ignore the rest of the noise and focus on the same sources that you think are going to be reliable and help guide your decision making every single race week. Multiple opinions are going to cloud your judgment. It might create more confusion than it's worth. And the more people you listen to, the more noise there is. So I would limit the consumption of fantasy information to a select few sources and people. And if you think that works, great. If you think you're more of a strategist that likes to pick and choose different sources and information as you go, sure, do that too. But essentially it is your own team. It is your own game. The decisions rest with you. If you want to copy my team, be my guest, but you're still making the decisions for your team. And I think the last thing is, it is, as I say, a fantasy game. It's meant to be fun. So play your own game. Don't be afraid to go against the narrative every so often. If you think you have a gut feeling that Pierre Gasly is going to bounce back, he's been building up, or he's going to build up to a really successful race weekend after a couple of really good P4s or P5s, then play that game. Play that Pierre Gasly pick, and hopefully it pays off. But there's no rule to say you can't or you have to pick certain drivers and constructors. It's fantasy. It's meant to be fun. And I think I get a lot of enjoyment sometimes out of playing my own game, even if I don't necessarily go with the same drivers that everyone's going for. I enjoy the reward of going off the track, the beaten track a little bit, and picking someone that I think is going to do well. And when it does pay off, it's a great feeling. So anyway, that's kind of it, guys. A few tips that hopefully help you become a better fantasy strategist to take your team to the next level. But there's going to be a lot more content coming out in the lead up to the season kicking off at the end of February, the start of March in Bahrain. So please do subscribe if you haven't already, because there's going to be a few more videos. And as I said in the video, plenty more deadline streams and videos with FanAmp I'll be doing over the course of the season. So check them out too if you want more of that. But I'll leave it here for now, guys. I appreciate you dropping by, and I'll see you all very soon.